Just to say that what we're looking at, and I want us to look at today, is how do you begin to think about harnessing the power of stories in terms of selling new ideas and new concepts. I think that what Ed was talking about is very relevant and apposite to what we're going to be talking about. I do represent the dark side, as Kate said, probably the darkest of the dark sides, working for the BBC. And I want to tell you one thing straight away, which I found really interesting, that although I have spent about 185 years making programs at the BBC, I'm pretty ancient. I didn't quite start in black and white as a researcher, but not far off. That's all I'm prepared to say on the subject. One of the things that became really interesting to me is that I don't think we ever made the link to start thinking about, is there something we can do about storytelling, about using this extraordinary power at our disposal to begin to think about storytelling in other mediums, and particularly in non-programming areas. Just to say that my journey in terms of thinking about storytelling for other purposes than simply in terms of entertainment engagement on television really began when the BBC, as it does so often, was going through yet another process of massive change. And I was asked to start to help some of the senior leaders in the BBC to think about how they could actually begin to articulate change, which was less than 185 rather depressing PowerPoints about just how many people in the BBC were about to lose their jobs. Amazing, isn't it, to think that one of the foremost preeminent storytellers in the world found it almost impossible in terms of their internal communications to do anything else than to offer us a lot of pie charts and very gloomy statistics about our financial misfortunes, most of which meant that the audience that the senior leaders were trying to address, to galvanize them to go to this new and exciting far-off place, actually would rather cut their throats and die than go on this journey to this brave new world. So I began to think about there's something about using stories to create images, future visions, if you like, of a place where people actually wouldn't quite might want to go, rather than to give up the will to live and actually head very quickly towards the exit. It was the most remarkably difficult transformation that I was trying to achieve here, because it seemed to go against the grain of everything the BBC stood for internally, which was all about, I need to tell you about the depressing negative messages, because then perhaps you'll understand why it is so difficult for me to tell you all you're about to be sacked. And I thought, wait a minute, let's think about this from a completely different point of view. How about we tell positive stories? How about we tell stories about current change and how it's about people? It's about ordinary people who've embraced change, found new solutions to the same old problems. And then, if you like, exciting things start to happen. It's about storytelling, which is going to actually elicit a response in the audience, which is, I want to be part of this. It's about thinking about what is the purpose of the story I'm going to tell. How can I embed that story in the presentations we're making, where they will have to get some of the grim grief news as well. But could I find a way at some stage of looking at ordinary people and how ordinary people have done the most remarkable things? If you like, that then became a catalyst for getting other people involved as well to think, wait a minute, if those people can do it, so can I. So this was the beginning of my journey about thinking about how, in a business context, could we start to use the tools, if you like, of great narrative construction to begin to engage our audiences and to hope to take them on a journey that they wanted to go on. So if you like, just in headline terms, that was my starting point. The next point was to start thinking about this. What really is the power of stories? What is it that we can look at to begin to think about how powerful stories are? And I want to offer you this. There's a nice quote, it's an anonymous one, and it goes like this. Dogs sniff each other, we tell stories. We're a storytelling species. From the day you were born, people told you stories, normally to shut you up and stop you crying. As you got a little bit older, you began to, maybe they started reading to you all the famous classical fairy stories. And then as you started to read yourself, you then became steeped, immersed, and effectively hardwired and imprinted in how stories work. And it also, therefore, made you a perfect storyteller. So number one, if you like, is to start thinking about this. If we're a story-telling species, why don't we spend more time telling each other stories? And I've made this point. It's how we communicate with each other. One of my great frustrations running big production teams was they used to spend nearly all of their days in what I always was convinced was meaningless gossip. But actually it wasn't just gossip, they were telling each other stories. And that was how they began to make relationships with each other, communicated important ideas. And I've said, it is the way we make the sense of the world and the world around us is through storytelling. The other point which I think is really important is to say that it's a very, very good way also of using stories to get across the most complex of ideas. So you can throw away all the PowerPoints, you can throw away all the pie charts. We don't want the facts, we don't want the stats until the stories begin to engage us. So if you like, it's about thinking at the beginning, if you're going to start using stories, about what is my big message? What is the purpose of the story I'm going to tell? How can I use the story to emotionally engage? And that's what great stories do, to emotionally engage us and take us to another place. Hopefully they need to be positive stories. If you're going to think about using stories at some stage in any presentation to get across some of these key messages, the big ideas, think about the right story which is going to elicit an emotional reaction that then says to people, I now can hear the detail. You've convinced me and engaged me and excited me and intrigued me. Now I'm ready to hear the reasons why, the background, the information, the stats. It's such a much more powerful way to go about it. So if you like, it's this sense, as I've said, it's about stories helping to make sense of information, stats and data, and understand their relevance and meaning. And I think the other point that I've made is about memorability. It is often the case for me as a factual program maker, a lot of which was documentary making, a lot of it was entertainment programs predominantly, but nevertheless there was always going to be some kind of a takeaway. And what I found really interesting was that if you made a rather boring, turgid history program full of facts and stats, which are fascinating to us maybe, you left your audiences completely cold. If on the other hand you could get the story to start to work, it was through the power of the story that people had the most remarkable amount of information that almost by stealth, hardly were they aware of the fact that they'd taken in vast amounts of information. So in other words, the trigger was something dramatic that happened in a story. It was our emotional engagement with the characters in the story, the incidents, the drama, and the conflict. And it was through that they also, almost as a byproduct, remembered the information as well. So I think, and I hope you'll agree with me, that all of these combined says, this is very, very powerful stuff. It's very fruitful. How can we begin to think about harnessing it? Now, if I can find this, and I might need some help, I've got a little film that I want to show you. Do you all, or are you familiar of a big BBC telethon that happens remorselessly every November? It's called Children in Need. Are you aware of Children in Need? Okay, I'm going to show you a very short film. It's about 3 minutes long of an absolutely classical, typical Children in Need film. The only reason I'm going to say this in headline before I show it to you is that, needless to say, these films have an absolutely clear purpose and a message. And the clear purpose and the message is, I'm going to show you a film which will elicit the following action. You will be so moved, hopefully, by this film that you will ring up in droves and pledge vast amount of money, probably more than you can afford, to a particular cause. So in other words, the purpose is absolutely clear. The film, hopefully, will elicit that response. I can find it. Have a look at this.
It's been really, really hard to make friends. I'm just a bit nervous about introducing myself to new people.
People think because he speaks well that there's absolutely no problem, and a lot of people forget Sam is deaf.
I've got a condition called auditory neuropathy, which means you start off profoundly deaf and then you regain a little bit of your hearing.
It's been quite hard with triplets. Sam was less confident in social situations, so at parties, for example, Isabel and Edward would go straight in there, and Sam said to me, I'm not going.
He used to be on his own, so I just felt really like I wanted to help him, but I couldn't.
Nights were really, really tough. He was scared and he didn't know where we were.
I can't hear my parents talking downstairs or the TV being on. I just couldn't sleep.
I think Sam's record was 27 times I put him back to bed, and it was like that every night. He was just exhausted. Certainly when he started school, he'd have an annual report, and in that it was always mentioned he was so tired. You know, I can only imagine how difficult it is for him.
2 years ago, Sam met someone very special.
Good girl.
Sam was so excited about having her. Literally, that first week, I was stunned about the difference. It was just fantastic.
Ember isn't just Sam's pet. She is one of over 750 highly trained hearing dogs in the UK. Thanks to you, dogs like Ember can support deaf children in their daily lives and alert them to potential dangers.
She does give him that sense of security and safety. He's always been very scared of fire because he can't hear smoke alarms. So that's what Ember does. She nudges his leg and she drops to the floor and she'll wait till he responds. I think Sam's confidence has improved hugely since he's had Ember. He's incredibly proud of her, and in the past where he'd hang back, if people are asking questions about Ember, he'd say, "That's my dog."
Ember. Good girl.
But the biggest difference we saw was sleep. From that first week, Sam slept through. I couldn't believe that having a dog sleeping in your bedroom could make such a difference. She helps him have a happy childhood, and that's what every parent wants for their child.
Kind of scary what life would be like without Ember and without hearing dogs, because it changed my life a lot.
She does her job really, really, really well. 100% she's part of the family now. She's brilliant.
She's my best friend, because I know she's always there for me, and she's just amazing.
Thanks to you, Sam has a new best friend that has made him feel happy and safe. Please help us start more very special partnerships.
If I can find my way out of this film. So as you can see, needless to say, winning combination, particularly in this country, kids and dogs, or kids and animals, in terms of tugging at the heartstrings. Oh, there we go. I can't get out of this. Here we go. So, let us just spend a few minutes thinking about, therefore, from the evidence of that film, what are we talking about in terms of elements? This is to give you, if you like, a kind of roadmap of how you begin to think at an early stage, once you've decided that you want to use a story in some form, in some duration, in order to sell your idea, to make sure that people get the big message. What do you need in a great story? And I've said right at the top, and I think it's really important, and forgive me, you can throw things at me, just a reminder, a story has a beginning, a middle, and end. In other words, it's not a whole lot of stuff just vaguely chucked together. Number two, I've talked about a big story question, which is incredibly important because this is going to be, if you like, the most useful structuring tool that you'll ever have, because it'll give you a sense of direction and travel. It'll give you a sense of beginning to anticipate how will your story end, what will narrative closure look like. Big story questions are always associated in terms of, if you're talking about individual characters and their journey, about the association is always going to be about whose story is it, and fundamentally what does that person want. In this particular case, and I want to use Sam's story as a reference point for this as well, it is clearly Sam's story. It is all about Sam. And therefore, if you like, if the driving question is somewhere around, how can Sam be helped to lead a normal 10-year-old's life? Always, in terms of story questions, you need to signpost them very clearly right at the beginning of a story. In other words, what you're setting up in your audience's mind is a clear sense of suspense and anticipation. In other words, once they've got the question and have bought into that question associated with the character's journey and what it is they're trying to do, achieve, then anticipation starts in your audience. They'll stick with your film because they want to know, they're gagging to know, how will it turn out? How will it be resolved? And hopefully in this case, I want a happy ending. I've also then talked about characters. Clearly, the main driver And what we love and crave in stories is characters. We're natural bon voyeurs. We have an insatiable curiosity about other people. We know from all of those stories from the past and the great fairy stories we've heard, it's about protagonists, it's about people that we can engage with, but most important of all, care about. Because if you don't care, you're not going to be emotionally engaged. So that's the mechanism. So you need to work really hard at the beginning of your stories to make sure you give us some kind of character exposition. Show us something about the character. Tell us about something about the character that begins to make them come alive for us. What kind of a person are they? How might we relate and connect with them? But most important of all, if you're going for positive ending stories, you need to make people care and like this character and desperately want them to succeed. I've talked about an inciting incident. Really important, even in very short story form, is to start thinking about what, if you like, propelled and motivated these characters to want to do something, to want to achieve something. The starting point for Sam's story was quite obviously, and that's why the mother's interview was so important here, when she was talking about the backstory before Amber arrived and saying, I don't know if you remember, he didn't seem to sleep at all. He came down 20 or 30 times a night because he was so scared that he could hear nothing and was worried about the fact that maybe the house was empty and they'd all gone. He was tired. The teacher's evidence was that he was so tired he could hardly function at all. So if you like, that was the inciting incident. In other words, that moment when somebody or something has to take some kind of action, forced into taking some kind of action to try and find some kind of solution to whatever that presenting problem was. A story, I've said, is a seamless flow, and you need to think about this. In terms of linear construction, it's a question always of beginning to think about, what are the building blocks of my story? What's going to happen from this opening, from this inciting incident where the story is motivated and begins, what is going to happen next? So it's almost a question at an early stage of beginning to think about the story, structuring and planning to think, this is the starting point. There are going to be a number of incidents and events that gets me from that opening to this particular close where the big story question will be resolved. So you need to start thinking about what are the events, what is the information, what development in storyline can we begin to put in even a short story. So you're thinking about the big building blocks as a starting point. I've talked about structure, I mentioned it before. If anybody ever says to you, this story has so many dramatic qualities, it's so powerful, it's so engaging, it'll tell yourself, you have my permission to shoot them, because stories do not tell themselves. You, the architect of the story, needs to work long and hard to begin to find the best, hopefully most simple way to structure it. I think the apotheosis of great storytelling, no matter how complicated and rich and layered stories might be, is that basically good storytelling is telling one story simply and elegantly. And therefore you need to guard with your life what precisely is my story about, whose story is it, and then you can start thinking about how you're going to tell it. In terms of emotional engagement, the last point that I'm making here, which is really important, is just a gentle reminder. You need to work quite hard at the opening of a story. Nobody is truly emotionally engaged in a fully paid up audience to your stories unless they've been intrigued, their curiosity has been aroused and whetted right at the beginning. What might you say, what might you show, maybe a combination of show and tell at the beginning, which is beginning to make people buy into the story. It's really important. You guard your openings and closings with your life. I hesitate to say the rest can be rubbish. No, it can't, but on the other hand, if you get the opening wrong, you're in trouble before you start. Intrigue them, show them something that perhaps they're looking at and thinking, I wonder what that is. Don't contextualize it straight away. Give them that moment to begin to think, what's going on here? Why did someone say that? Why is somebody doing that? It's always a great way to start. So starting point is really important. However, once you've aroused their curiosity, you then need to signpost really clearly those really big story questions, those key considerations. Whose story is this? Who's the character I'm going to engage with and care about? What exactly is their problem? What are they trying to do and achieve? So you need to signpost really clearly on what it is, if you like, that's driving your story arc. That then becomes sustainable. Also, once they know what the big story question associated with the character's journey is, then they can start to, in terms of anticipation and suspense, to begin, if you like, to start anticipating how might it end. I hope in this particular case they find a solution for Sam, and hey presto, much to the love of a British audience, as I said, it turns out that the solution is a four-legged furry thing, which we all love to pieces. And again, therefore, there is a clarity now of what is it that I'm offering in terms of the problem, What am I anticipating in terms of the possible solution? How am I going to show them the solution? And substantially across the rest of the film answer the question, how will this ridiculous animal change Sam's life in the most remarkable way? And give him, as his mother said at the beginning, an ordinary childhood, as close as possible to an ordinary childhood that every other child, those with completely perfect hearing, would expect and enjoy. Does that all make sense to you? You all right with that? Now, the reason I'm asking you whether that makes sense is because you're now about to use this. Are you, at this moment, everyone's going to leave because they know what I'm going to say. Are you all up for telling each other a bit of a story? The answer is yes. Okay, and this is how we're going to do it. I'm going to get each of you to think about planning and preparing a little 2-minute story, no more, that you're going to tell to somebody you've never met before in this room. In other words, the mechanism is quite simple. You're going to turn to somebody beside you or close to you and you're going to say, hello, my name is X and I've got a wonderful story to tell you. Now, as far as the content of these stories is concerned, it's really quite simple. I want you to think about how could you find a short story obeying all of those key elements we've talked about here, which is going to engage and rivet them, which is going to give them some insight into what you're currently working on. All right? It's as simple as that. So rather than boring them to death by giving them an hour and a half of every single thing you've done in your current thesis, the paper you're about to produce, I want you to start thinking about how can I extract from that one story, a character-driven story, which is going to engage them, excite them, and give them some big headlines, some key messages about what I am, who I am, and what I do. Is that all right? Yes. I'll answer these questions for you so you don't have to. Okay. And here are the questions for you. Needless to say, based on what I was talking about before in terms of what are the elements, the must-have elements of any great story. And it goes as follows. Don't worry too much about the primary audience, that's less important today, but of course in the real world, when you're thinking about using these stories, it's a really good idea to be very audience focused right from the beginning. Who are the people I'm talking to? What kind of stories told in what way are going to engage them, excite them, intrigue them? The next is, needless to say, that you need to start thinking about what is the purpose of the story? What do I want them to do as a result? Now, it may be that you simply want to emotionally engage them. It may be slightly more. It may be that your film, very much as the Children in Need films are, is actually a call to arms. You want people to do something, to take an action as a result. It's a very good starting point for any story, is to think about what do I want the outcome for my story to be? What do I want them to do as a result of this? Remember that example I gave you of the BBC? I hoped that I could persuade the senior leaders to tell stories that made people want to stay in the organisation, no matter how rocky the road to change was going to be. So it's always important to start thinking about the purpose. Next, a light upon character. It could be you, doesn't have to be. Who do you think is going to be the main character whose story this is? Really important. And begin to think a little bit as well about what do they want, what is their journey going to be about, and therefore that'll be associated with the big story question that is driving your story. Okay, now it could be, don't get me wrong, a group of people. It could be characters, it doesn't need to be one. But this is your protagonist. Also, if you like in great storytelling, you don't want it to be too obvious to your dear audience that it's going to be an absolutely seamless, easy road to being able to get to the end and to achieve whatever it is you want your character to achieve. Good stories about drama and conflict, and the drama and conflict comes of the obstacles that you can put in the way of your main character achieving whatever they want, whatever they're trying to do. Yeah? Because we all know in ordinary life nothing is easy and simple. And if you try to present somebody with a very simple and easy story where they're already beginning to anticipate, I know how this story is going to end, then the chances are they will simply leave your story in droves and they won't wait for the ending because they think they know what it is already. So you need to put these obstacles, struggles, in their path. Make it difficult for them, because that's where drama and conflict comes, and it makes this a much more engaging and realistic story. Think about the inciting incident, as I said before. What has motivated this action taken by your character? Give us a sense of where the starting point was. often this will be associated, as it was in Sam's story, with giving us some background and context into what the presenting problem was. Tell us what the problem was, and then we can begin to anticipate how did they find a solution. It's as simple as that. Inciting incidents is important. It gives you a starting point for your story. Think a little bit about what's going to happen. What are the one or two things in your very short 2-minute stories you're about to tell? In terms of the incidents, the events, what did your character do? What were they trying to do in order to be able to achieve whatever their end goal was going to be? What did they need to do in order to get there? It's really important. Story resolution, needless to say, as I said, is totally associated with you knowing what is the driving question for your story. When you know what the big story question is, you're then beginning to get a sense of how is this going to end. And that's why it's so important, because as I said, it gives you a structuring tool, because you already know in bookending terms how it opens and how it closes. Also really important when you're beginning to finesse stories is to begin to think about, how do I want my audience to emotionally engage with this story? Are they going to cry a lot? Are they going to feel sad? Are they going to be angry as a result? Great storytellers, I'm sure you'd agree, are arch manipulators. Yeah? Total megalomaniacs. A good storyteller can hit you with the right buttons and press all the right buttons to make you feel as they want you to feel. You don't leave it to chance. You always ask yourself, if I show this, if this happens in my story, what do I gauge will be the emotional response from my audience? Needless to say, if you're going to start thinking about using stories to help to sell powerful messages, 90 times out of 100, they need to have positive endings. You know, if my senior leaders in the BBC said, I'm going to tell you this story about a group of people in a department that I once run who tried to change things and they were so unsuccessful I had to fire them all, I'm not sure that's going to motivate me to want to go anywhere with this particular person. So in other words, you need to think about positive endings very much in the way that the Children in Need one did. If they had told you a really sad, horrific, tear-driven story about poor Sam, in which actually things for him, his condition got worse rather than better, because the dog bit him, for instance, I don't think you would have found an awful lot of people rushing to the phone with their credit cards in their hands. So without further ado, I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 minutes to think about what story you're going to tell, about yourself and about your work. The messages and the purpose is yours and yours alone to think about. You've got 5 minutes to think about preparing the story, and when that 5 minutes is up, I then want you to turn, embrace your neighbour, or at least shake their hands, and tell them a cracking, riveting story, and then swap roles. About a 2-minute story. Prep time starts now. Okay, I'm going to bring you to a halt. I hope that I'm not cutting you off just as you're coming to the most dramatic denouement for your stories. Can I ask you a question? Those of you who listen to stories, did you get some good stories? Were you engaged by the stories you heard? Yes? Good. Are you just being very kind to each other, or is it true? I hope it's true. Anyway, thank you so much, and I hope this, in a whistle-stop tour of a massive subject area, has given you just a few thoughts, a few pointers, and a few elements and tricks that you can use yourself. Please go away and tell great stories. The more you do it, like any skill, the better you get at, the more you can facilitate it. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Frank. We've just got a few more minutes before we hit our time deadline. I just wondered if there were questions for any members of the panel tonight. And I think you'll agree all of it was really interesting, really different, a really different way of looking with issues that I'm guessing you're dealing with all of the time. So any questions for anybody over there?
Not quite a question, but presumably the story has got to be a good one. I just had the unfortunate experience of watching 12 consecutive 20-minute presentations where everybody had been trained in the TED type thing. And everybody came on and said, I want to tell you about my grandmother. And after you'd heard that 12 times, you thought, oh my God, I don't want to hear about anybody else's grandmother. Because yes. They weren't good stories. They were just little kind of snippets whereby they were trying to capture you, and it didn't work at all.
I think the short answer, and I kind of hinted at that, is to think about if you're embedding them in maybe a longer presentation, you need to be really careful about where you choose to tell the story. At what point do you tell it? But you also need, just as a gentle reminder, to make sure that this story is absolutely the right story, which helps you to convey the purpose, the meaning, the big idea, the call to arms, whatever it is. So in other words, if it's just an incidental, nice-to-have story, which doesn't help you in terms of selling the message, getting people to do things, don't even bother. Don't even bother, because I think then people are thinking, why do I need to know about the grandmother? And in their minds, while they're telling this infernal story, yet, the grandmother take 12, as you described it, they're probably thinking, does this have any relevance whatsoever with what I came to be excited by in this presentation in the first place? So in other words, they need to be an absolutely perfect fit, that they're going to help you in some way to deliver something very big and powerful in the context of what it is you're trying to tell, say, or get them to do. Does that help?
Over there.
Just from what you said, your feedback, my question is, how easy do you think it is to change your story?
What, as you're saying it? As you're delivering it?
Either short term or over a long period of time. Obviously, the story is always evolving.
Yeah. Do you mean this is a story, a personal story, a story about you?
No, in sort of wider context, if you wanted to apply it to NCD, for example, and what the priorities are and what the message is, that will change.
Of course it will, and therefore I would always advocate that, if you're talking about getting a huge body of knowledge across, which has a number of different elements to it, it may be that you're thinking about an individual story for each and every one of those elements, and it's a different story. But again, I think, really it goes back to what I said to you in preparation terms, is to think, why am I bothering to tell a story in the first place? What's its purpose? And how will it help to deliver whatever it is you want to deliver? And if it's a call to arms, then, needless to say, you might be thinking that maybe I will do that in one of the elements of the big messages I'm trying to get across. In another one, it may be less a call to arms. It may be that you want to use a really nice change example story to say, I want to tell you about what happened to Fred and Fred's team. It's a very short story, but hopefully what it does is to inspire people, engage people, and make them perhaps want to replicate Fred's successes. So in other words, you need, as the storyteller, to think about different stories with different purposes to achieve and elicit different outcomes is really important. And again, do be careful, because there is a danger that you go down the grandmother syndrome, and it may be that half your audience walks out on you because they said, well, we told that story last time you were here. That's not great. So I think you do need to refresh them and constantly be looking for new characters and new examples that help to move your story, the big narrative, on. Does that help?
Any other questions, and for the rest of the panel as well, before we finish tonight?
Because it really does speak to that idea that if you understand kind of why you're doing what you're doing, your message has to change. It has to evolve. It has to incorporate your experience and also recognise the different audiences that you're talking to. And it also gives you the opportunity then to do all sorts of different things, because if you understand what your purpose is, then you're not locked into a particular thing, a particular narrative, or a particular, kind of product, or whatever it might be. You can experiment and you can play with all sorts of different things as long as it fits that purpose and that why.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you again to the panel. And if you're very lucky, you might be able to catch Frank, Fred, and Ed just before they leave. So thank you so much again.